So,
one last thing.
there. So again, obviously there's another presentation that's sexier than this one. That's okay. All right, so this is a couple people that were in my earlier presentation. So this is actually a bit of a corollary. So in the other one we were talking about how to organize as a team and make sure we're all on the same page. This is how we communicate between the development team and the business, right? Making sure that we're building the right thing. So I've been trying to make sure that projects work for a long time in different contexts, and communicating complex requirements is just, it's difficult. It's a hard thing. I've been working with different techniques to come to conclusions about how to make projects work as smoothly as possible. I find that projects I work on generally run smoothly and everybody enjoys it. And so I'm trying to share the joy. Yeah. Well, this is it. I mean, this is my job, right? So like I want to have a good life. And so I work very hard to figure this stuff out. So we'll look at some of that. No doubt you've been in a context that sounds similar to this, right? It essentially comes down to, that's not what I asked for, right? And from a developer standpoint, it's like, pretty sure it is. It's what you said. It's what we wrote down. That's what I built. And then put project managers in between going like, what, how, what, right? So, this leads to all kinds of problems. Rework and delays being the big ones that from a project management standpoint mean your budget's going to be blown, your schedule is going to be blown, et cetera. But then from a human level, you also get frustration and loss of trust, and projects sort of spiral in some cases if things start to go that way. And then depending on context, we'll show one later, if the project requires an audit of some sort at some point, that risk just goes up when you're not ensuring that you're clear about what you're trying to do. So a lot of it comes down to different expectations and different uses of the same words, right? English in any language, we can't be super specific about what a word means. And so when I say I want something to be user-friendly, chances are it's going to mean something slightly different from everybody else. So some are a little clearer, right? Accessible, say WCAG 2AA, like there's some specific stuff you can get around. But that's what you should be specifying, right? Not just saying it should be accessible. So this is one of the things that actually caused me to use Bayhat and Gherkin was a project that had specifications like this, right? That were just, the system has to support both official languages. And I said, well, what does that mean? Do we need to author things in different languages? Does the person have to be able to navigate in different languages? Like, what are we talking about? And so rather than these sort of broad generalizations of what you want the system to do, the idea here is to take a perspective of looking at who's using it, how, right? What are they actually doing? How are they interacting with it? And at this point, that's what Gherkin kind of comes into play with, right? So it's a human-readable language for describing behavior of a system and how you interact with it and what you expect to come out of it. So the foundation of it all is this given, when, then triumvirate. Okay, so these using that specifically when you're describing things, you can have multiple of each of these, but essentially when you're saying given some context, so given I'm not logged in, when I click the login link, then I should see a password field, right? Something along those lines. So given whatever the context is, I'm not logged in, I'm on the front page, etc. When I take some action, could be a series of actions, right? So the series of actions could be I click the login link, I fill in the username field, I fill in the password field, and I click login, then I should see some result. Depending on whether I put in the right username and password, I'm going to be logged in or not, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we want to be able to test. What this does is it gives people the ability to describe subject matter experts, right? Not programmers, people who are going to use it, who are trying to describe to you how they want it to behave. You're giving them the tools to be able to describe it to you in a concrete fashion, right? Rather than a lot of what subject matter experts do, which is they think in systems, right? They think the big picture and how the data interacts and stuff like that, which is helpful, it's important, but it doesn't really help in a lot of cases define what the behavior of the system should do. So this kind of forces you into thinking in this cause and effect mode, right? You're going to do something and you're going to see an effect. And so that really makes it easier for us to be able to define observable behavior for the system, which also becomes testable behavior. So we might start with something like it must support both official languages, and then we'll get a scenario that'll be, I need to be able to view the platform in French. And so given the user has selected French as their option, right, it won't necessarily look like this. This is like pseudo Gherkin, okay? Like generally what this would actually say is, given a user has selected French from the language selector, right? And so you've got some fields and stuff like that. When they navigate to the dashboard, so a real version of this would be like when I am on /home or something like that, then the content is displayed in French. So instead of saying welcome, it'll say bienvenue, right? That kind of thing. So let me jump right into a case study, the one that I mentioned in passing earlier. We had a whole long list of these vague requirements, and it was a large NGO. We need to build this community of practice, and it was funded by a grant, which meant that there was going to be an audit at the end to make sure that it satisfied all of these requirements. And we had never, this is like 8 or 9 years ago, we had never gone through an audit like that, so we didn't really understand what that was going to look like. So we were trying to understand, we talked to the auditor who had come out of retirement to do this. He knew his stuff inside and out. So he was able to kind of say, like, well, generally it's going to work this way, right? And so we'll get into what that looked like, but I'll show you what that list is and how we kind of used Bayhat and Gherkin and a variety of other things to kind of overcome this. So the problem with requirements is that they're sort of big picture, right? They're clear enough that people can agree and be like, yeah, sure, I want good things, right? But they're way too vague to be able to implement something that I can say, yes, it does support both languages. And the auditor explained to us very kindly what this was going to look like. He needed to look at each of these requirements, and he needed to verify that the functionality existed in the system and that the behavior matched what the expectation was. And then usually this is an iterative process. So you build out the system, we do our best effort to address all of these things. He comes in towards the end, he reviews it all, he comes back with a list of these are the things that I need evidence for that I haven't been able to find, these are the things that don't behave the way that we would expect based on the specifications, and so forth. Now, this was one of our very first projects as an agency, and so it was actually a fixed bid. So what we didn't want was months and months and months of back and forth, right? So from the very get-go, understanding that this was a requirement, we were like, okay, how are we going to make this make sense for us? So the first thing was we started to work with the people that were the project stakeholders to get the requirements into user stories, and then starting to get those into scenarios. We'll see what that looks like. And turn those into actual tests that we would run. Okay? So what this allowed us to do was each of these requirements had a code associated with it. And what we could do is within Bayhat and most most programs that implement Gherkin, right? So you've got Cucumber in Python, it's Behave is in Python, Cucumber I believe is in Ruby. You can tag scenarios, and what that allows you to do is you can run just the ones that have that tag. But what this allowed us to do was to link the vague requirement to a set of scenarios that satisfied the requirement. And so once we had made that, we built out a table with the requirements, and we started to link the scenarios and the output. So the auditor, when he saw this, and I'm about to show it to you, was just blown away. He came in, he went through his audit, it was green flags all the way, no rework, no nothing, immediately approved, and we got paid, and the rest is history. So it was exactly what we wanted. It was surprising from his standpoint, because he had never seen anything work that way before. And let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. But here are the kinds of requirements, right? This is a community of practice, so the COP will be a nationwide platform including all provinces and territories. Okay. But you can see that a lot of these are, to provide a platform for shared knowledge. Like, I understand what they're trying to get at, but like, how do we build something that does that, right? So what we started to do, as I mentioned, is we actually built these into the tests, and then we ran the tests. And so, let me find one here. Right, so results. So what we then did was we ran the tests passing in that tag, which meant that it was only going to run the tests that were tagged that way. So we built a little script that generated this page that for every one of these tags would have the results of the tests that had been tagged that way. And so for us, as we built it, we were able to confirm which ones were missing, which ones hadn't we achieved yet. And then by the time the auditor came along, he was able to just go through this and just check off, yep, okay, yep, okay. And then some of these are, like, we flagged as like, these are just platform things. They're not, all areas, this is a platform benefit. It's sort of a little too woo-woo for us to build something that could prove it, right? And he was okay with that. He was perfectly happy with the auditor with that. But we have all of these examples, and this is a long, long page, right? And there's a lot of duplication here, because the same that you'll see in some of these, we're hitting 2 or 3 different requirements, right? So what we'll do is we're gonna rerun those tests in this context for each one of the requirements, and that way he would see, yeah, that seems to satisfy what the requirement is. Right? So this was the only project where we got to this level of detail in building this out, but it's really nice to know that we can, because we use Gherkin all over the place in other contexts. We've never had to link it to these kind of vague requirements before. And generally, when we're working with people, we sort of start with user stories and so forth that are kind of part of how we describe these, right? So the feature itself, the description at the highest level, is going to be just a brief explanation of what it's supposed to be, and then we have an actual user story, right? In order to achieve some goal, as a role, I want to take some action, I want to use some feature, right? So that sort of context within Gherkin, it's often the case that we're going to document things with user stories, but this is purely for human documentation purposes. This does not get run as part of the test suite that usually accompanies this. Whereas once we get into the scenarios, the given, when, then structure actually translate into code that gets run as tests. Right? All right, so I'll come back to this. So I had used Bayhat and Gherkin previously, but this was the thing that really opened my eyes to just how powerful it could be in terms of satisfying these like super weird, complex, vague requirements, and getting to the point where we were sure we understood each other, we were sure we understood what was going on. As we wrote these out, we were doing that collaboratively with the clients, and they would sign off on, yes, indeed, that is what we mean when we say this broader thing, right? So we went from these vague requirements through user stories to scenarios, automated tests, and then eventually, in this case, audit evidence, but that generally isn't something that's actually a requirement. What this allows us to do is build up a shared language, a domain-specific language. So there's a whole host of steps that come sort of baked in with your package. In this case, it's Bayhat with Mink, which is the web part of it, and then there's a bunch of Drupal-specific stuff, right? Given a user with the username foo, right? It'll create that for you. What we do with that is those are sort of the bare bones, and then we start to build stuff that's more specific to a given project. Let's see, can I make sure this is the right one? Oh yeah, okay. So Synchrony is a project that we built to do sociocracy, which was part of the previous session. And it has different entity types. I'm not going to go into exactly what they are, but there's circles, there's aims, there's roles and responsibilities. And these have a relatively defined structure to them. So a circle will have members and it'll have aims, and roles will have responsibilities and live within a circle. And so you've got all of this sort of hierarchy of this sort of information hierarchy and how these things fit together. So we'll do basic stuff like just CRUD, right? Just the ability to create a circle, and given I'm logged in with an appropriate role, when I click Create Circle and I fill in the required fields, and I select a parent field and I press Save, I should see something like Circle created. Again, in reality, this is a little bit different, but this is sort of close enough. This is great with a circle, but if I then need to do something with an aim, and an aim has to have a reference to a circle, I need to create a circle first as part of my test. So in this case, I'm reproducing all of these steps to create the circle, and only then do I get to create the aim. So what we want to do in this case is sort of combine these into a step that just creates the circle. So in this context, we still want to test more specifically what creating that entity type is. But when we're just creating that as a fixture for another test, then we don't need that level of specificity, and all it's doing is getting in the way. It's just noise, right? And if we have to change how a circle is created, now I have to go and update a bunch of different tests that we're setting these up. So what we do is we just wrap that into a single step. This is from a programming standpoint, right? We create a step that says, given a circle labeled whatever, and then that will just, inside of it, follow the steps that we had defined in the CRUD test, right? I can show you an example of what that looks like. Let's see if I've got one handy. Bear with me for a minute, and I'll track one down. So where this is generally going to go is you're going to have a features directory. In your features directory, you can have subdirectories to organize your various features. Each of your features is going to have, here's the CRUD feature in this context. And then you're also going to have a bootstrap directory, which is where you have sort of your entry point for how the code maps up to these things. And so there's a couple different styles here. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to read. Okay. So you can use this style. This is sort of the older style of Bayhat, where you're using this @ symbol to say that this is a given, right? And then this is going to match, just pattern match, basically using regexes, and it's going to recognize that this is a variable, and so I now have a step available to me to say, given I wait, quote unquote, 5 seconds, and it will just go to sleep for 5 seconds. Right? So it's creating these test steps is really, really simple. It just immediately puts you into PHP in this case. And then a little further down, so this is the new style using annotations. And so, given I create the aim within the circle foo, right? And that's going to pass those in as variables. And then what it's going to do is do a little bit of bootstrapping just to get to the point where I'm logged in as an administrator. And then it's going to assert that I'm at the form to create the aim. And then it's going to fill in the field with the value that I put into the step. And then it's going to select the circle that I specified in the step. And then it's going to press save. Right? So it's going to do exactly the same thing that I would have done in defining each of those steps. And this is just the equivalent of this method, but for the press button, right? So you can just reuse these and build them up over time. And so what that allows us to do, coming back to the presentation, is to have more and more succinct steps like this that you build around your particular business use case, right? In this case, a circle is something that we care about. It's the kind of thing that we're building into the application. It's not going to be something that's like an entity or something that is sort of at the Drupal level of specificity, right? So we can start to build a business process, documentation, and so forth into what we're doing here. The other nice thing, just as an aside with Gherkin, is that these things do generally allow you to have these tests not just run automatically, but act as user acceptance tests. So you can hand these to users and they can actually follow these steps. So it's important when you're creating these kind of steps for it to be specific enough that if they know how to create a circle labeled whatever, that they can do that. As opposed to, here, so this is just a more complete example, right? So we wrap circles and then we add an aim where we point to that circle and a responsibility and then et cetera, right? So we just build it up so that by the time we're testing responsibilities that require all of these fixtures to be created, we've just got one line per fixture that we're creating without having to reproduce that more than later. So what we want to be able to do is make these tests succinct, right? They're reusable, I kind of covered a lot of this stuff, but the business intent is what's visible, right? We want to make sure that that's there. So this is a good abstraction, right? That we can do this. I can follow this instruction as an end user. This I can't, right? Now, we could decide to name it that way, and naming things is hard, but if I just say given everything is ready, I don't know what that means, right? And so as an end user trying to follow this instruction, that's a good heuristic to use, right? As to whether this is a useful level of abstraction or not. Is it a step that somebody who's familiar with the application can follow? And this is clearly one that isn't. So, as I mentioned, it's sort of, you're using the vocabulary of the business, of the project, of the application that you're trying to build in your test suite. So it allows you to get away from the Drupalisms and the specifics of like this field with this name and so forth, right? And you can start to get into levels of abstraction that are really helpful for people to be able to reason about what the behavior of the system ought to be without a lot of intermediate sort of noise, because that's the steps you have to go through to actually do it in reality, right? So in a different use case, so that one there was an application that we're building, and we're sort of building it on this vocabulary that's specific to it. Another project I've been working on for a long time is Rugged. Rugged is a back-end security system for Drupal.org. It's what's going to allow us to do auto updates and be confident that our systems aren't getting hacked by people sticking in code that shouldn't be there. So I started off, I didn't think this was going to work. I was like, I like Bayhat. It has worked for me in the past. This is a very different use case. Let's see, right? In this case, we were building something that was a CLI system with some workers, and there's no front end, so there's no clicky through forms, and so we wanted to see if we could work on this. So we had previously built Bayhat extensions that allowed us to interact on the command line. So I can run a command. Given I run a command, ls, then I should see this output. Right? We had already done that in other contexts to be able to do that. So I was like, all right, I have the fundamentals of what I need here. Let's see what we can do. And so in that case, we needed to interact with the command line. We needed to be able to observe changes on the file system. We needed to be able to look at the log output. There was this distributed worker environments where each is running in an isolated environment, and how do we interact with it in a way that we can make sure that it's doing the things we want. And then something that I alluded to earlier, if you try to log in, and you put in the wrong password, you shouldn't log in, right? It's really important to test failure modes, right? And in this case, security is one of the places where you want to test all the security modes, they're like the failure modes, right? So that was really something that I had experienced with Bayhat and Gherkin, and so I wanted to see if we could leverage it in this case as well. Also, this is my first real project in Python. I knew I was going to be rewriting the code repeatedly. Unit testing was not my priority. I was leveraging other libraries that did a bunch of this. It was the behavior of the system that I wanted to test, so that was why this was a viable option in that case as well. So, as I say, it was built for the Drupal Association. The security context was really hypercritical, right? Like, this is meant to secure the entire Drupal ecosystem. Right? So I, in recognizing that, felt a tremendous amount of pressure. And in order for me to feel okay about that, I wrote lots and lots of tests. Okay? And I tried as much as possible to make sure that we looked at every possible way that this thing could fail. And I'm happy to say that it's been running flawlessly for years now. There's other things that are delaying its production deployment, but we're working on those now too, so eventually we'll get there. But it was really a hard system to test, partially because we had multiple workers working in these individual environments, and we needed to be able to figure out how to look at that. So we ended up with, at last count, about 350 scenarios and 2,800 steps. What I did here was take a very strict TDD approach. So far we've been looking at BDD, behavior-driven development, right? Talking about the system in the way that people are going to interact with it and what the expectations are from a behavioral standpoint. TDD is more of a development practice where you write your test first, verify the test is going to fail, and then you write generally the minimal implementation that will get that test to pass. So it's important to observe the test failing because otherwise you might be testing something that never fails. So I remember one case where we had a test that we were expecting to fail, but it was passing because the word we were looking for happened to be in a menu that was collapsed, right? So we were like, I don't see it on the page. Where is it? And so we were just able to rewrite the test to be, oh, it should be in the content section of the page. And then the test failed appropriately, and then we were able to implement the feature that made the test pass. So in this case, this is sort of the difference, right, with TDD is you write that failing test, you write the code, you make it pass, and then you refactor, just continuously refactor. Whereas BDD is very much looking at sort of, does the application work? Does it do the thing you want it to do? So we started with really simple stuff, right? So we knew that there were going to be these different systems, these different workers, and so we wanted to just test that if I run a command line in one environment, I can get a response from one of these workers. And so it's just a simple echo, right? We were able to write that up. Again, this is sort of more pseudo than, pseudocode than how it actually is written. I can show you what that looks like. It's more involved and there's a lot more variables. Then we would make sure that we didn't get a response if we passed in the incorrect credentials, right? We did some of the basics of how we would do security, that we would get errors when we were expecting it to fail. So one of the things that we started off, I mentioned we had some CLI stuff, so we would have a test step that was given I run a command, right? And that given I run expected that command to pass, to succeed, right? But here we want that command to fail. So we had to write some of these that given I fail to run this command. So it'll run the command, but we're expecting it to fail. And so we were able to get output from that, and we were able to proceed on testing these failure modes effectively. So this was something that I have not had so in this test-driven development mode, you are meant to implement the dumbest approach to to making the test pass, okay? You're not supposed to actually build the thing, you're supposed to build the minimal implementation that will pass. And then iterate, right? And what that does in this context is it really forces you to think through what is the actual behavior. Because all too often what we're gonna look at is, does it emit the output I am expecting? So when I started writing this, I really took that to heart because of the security needs in this case, right? And so I added my first command, which was add a target, right? And the output should be target, file name, added. Great. The important thing here is the output is not the behavior, right? That's just one of the behaviors of the system. So let me see if I have I don't think I must have missed, okay. Basically what I did for implementing this was I said print target foo.txt added. that was my first implementation, okay? That was dumb, right? Like that's obviously not the implementation, but it got the test to pass, and it forced me to think about, okay, well, I'm going to be adding different file names, right? So if I have a test that says rugged add target bar.txt, then I expect the output to be bar.txt, not foo.txt. And so now I have to implement handling an argument, right? And then now that I'm saying target foo.txt added, it's like, well, what does that actually mean? It actually means that there's a file added to a particular metadata file. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but it forced me to start to think about what is the actual behavior and test that. And so I added a bunch of steps that would look at metadata files and look at the contents of that and make sure that the file was, the txt file was in the right place. I would look at the logs and I would make sure the logs reported the kind of output that I was expecting to see if it had actually processed anything, right? I could check whether a file was changed or unchanged, because depending on where this particular file would end up in the metadata, one file should change and another shouldn't. So I want to make sure that that's the case when I make these changes. So, we end up with things that get a lot more complicated, right? Given a file with a certain file name, and the last time the target metadata was updated was this time. When I add it, the target metadata should be changed, and the file should contain this content, right? So I was able to just add more and more of these steps that kind of checked on the kinds of behavior. And again, as with the previous example, I was able to build up a library of steps that were the kinds of things I needed to test the application I was building. So that was really eye-opening. I thought it would be possible, but like I said, I had doubts going into it because I'd never written this kind of stuff for purely CLI and like system level. But we were able to add these tests, these steps that sort of worked with it. It allows us to have, again, user acceptance tests, right? We can actually go and run these things. It's a nice sort of foundation for our documentation about how to run this stuff, because it runs through all of these different use cases and what the inputs and outputs ought to be. And so BDD and TDD are different, but are very useful together. BDD does not require that same approach, right? What it's really doing is making sure that you're understanding each other, that you have concrete examples that you can follow, and that there's this ongoing feedback loop back and forth about, as you build up the application, you're describing it in an effective way. So the majority of what this comes down to is you have to talk these things through with your subject matter expert and using that given, when, then framework that we started with, right? So that's really helpful, especially as I mentioned earlier, with a subject matter expert who's thinking in systems, right? Who's thinking in how this thing works big picture, to try to get it down to, okay, but you're sitting in front of a computer, you log in, what do you see? What do you do? What do you want it to be able to do for you, right? And that given, when, then framework really helps them to focus on that and be able to articulate what it is they want the system to do in an effective way. And so the work of this is figuring out what these things are, but then helping them to formulate it in a way that's going to be useful to you as a developer. So it might be a project manager or a business analyst that's actually doing some of this work. I tend to wear a lot of hats in these kind of projects. But then as you start to get there, you end up with stuff that looks closer to this. So these broader use cases that aren't like the step definitions aren't necessarily strictly what Bayhat's going to run, but that are clear enough for you to be able to agree with the end user. And then as you start to implement, you'll realize that, oh yeah, there's this extra field, and you'll fill it out. And then the other thing that this really provides is if a client comes to you with, that's not what I expected, then you can point to it and say, okay, where did we go wrong? Where was there something that we assumed, or that we didn't understand that, oh yeah, there's this extra field that I need to fill out, and that we didn't write it down, right? And so it's just, now we have sort of, okay, we're going through this process, there's somewhere specific we can point to and say, this is where we need to add this behavior, right? And so it makes it much easier for us to, and it's less frustrating, because it's not just these vague, like, it's supposed to do this thing, right? Instead, we can talk about effectively how to make that work. And then the automation part is just a cherry on top, right? Being able to test these things, big complex applications only become bigger and more complex. And so as you make changes in one place, you might be breaking stuff elsewhere. So having this library of tests that you've built up over time is super helpful in ensuring that everything continues to work. So this is just the distinction between them. I think I've walked through it fairly clearly. TDD is very much more of a developer-focused thing. It has to do with your practice of development, how you go about developing, whereas BDD is figuring out what to develop, right? What to work with, like what is it that the client is trying to do. So again, it's all about having the proper conversations. It's about being able to elicit examples that are going to be useful for you to be able to build these things. You can build out your automated tests. You've got your implementation that satisfies those tests, and then you can show the client that yes, indeed, it does the thing that we talked about. So at the end of the day, what I'm hoping that you'll be able to walk away from this with is a better understanding of how to come from vague requirements, which every project I've walked into has vague requirements. It either starts with nothing, which is the vaguest requirement of all, or it has some of these like high level, it needs to support both languages kind of stuff. And you can go all the way through to having full audit evidence of the project, satisfying the set of requirements. And along the way, you end up with this domain-specific language that describes your application, and you've encoded the point of the project in documentation that is written in English or French. You can translate Behat or Gherkin. That's one of the nice aspects of it. And it's stuff that you can put in front of end users. They can use, they can understand. New developers can come in, they can walk through this stuff. It's not putting all kinds of extra context or like programming idioms that they might not be familiar with. And they can kind of grok what it is that this is meant to be. And as we showed with the latter examples, it can be used in all kinds of contexts that you might not be thinking that it would, right? It's CLI application with distributed systems and security critical infrastructure and so forth. So again, those are the projects we kind of looked through, we talked through. I think I'm pretty much at the end. Gherkin is framed as a test syntax, but really it's a methodology. It's a toolkit that given when then piece of given some context, when you take an action, you see a result. It seems really like trivially simple, but it's exactly the thing that just unlocks the ability for people to describe what they want their system to do in a way that I've never seen any other tool. This is the highest impact tool